The sun hung low over Willow Springs, like molten copper poured across the western sky, casting long shadows through the marsh, where silver willows whispered secrets older than memory. Eliza Whitlow ran through the tall reeds, her cotton dress torn and muddied her heart, hammering not merely from exertion, but from the terrible certainty that the men pursuing her possessed souls as dark as the approaching night. The leather pouch at her waist, containing papers that could topple empires built on corruption, seemed to burn against her hip with each desperate stride. Behind her, hoofbeats thundered closer, accompanied by Rattler's voice slicing through the evening air like a rusty blade drawn across bone. There's our little wildcat corner her before she reaches deep water. 5 riders crashed through the marsh grass, their rifles catching the dying light like the fangs of metal predators. Eliza's breath came in sharp, painful gasps as she stumbled through ground that sucked at her boots like grasping fingers. Even with death mounted and pursuing her, thoughts flew to Dasan, to his gentle hands that could splint a bird's wing or track a deer through trackless stone, to the way he whispered her name in darkness, as if it were a prayer he feared the world might overhear. A sharp whistle cut the air, followed by the solid thunk of an arrow burying itself in Rattler's hat brim with the precision of divine judgment. The impact knocked the hat clean away, sending the scarred gunman ducking low in his saddle, his face twisting with surprise and rage. What in blazes? From the cattails near the water's edge, Dasan emerged like something born from the marsh's primordial dreams. Water streamed from his dark hair and buckskin shirt as he moved with that fluid grace that had first stolen Eliza's breath months ago, the movement of a man equally at home in 2 worlds that would rather see him belong to neither. At 28, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had learned that survival meant reading the wind's whispers and the silence between a white man's words. Without hesitation, he swept Eliza into his arms, pulling her against his chest as gunfire erupted around them like the devil's own thunder. A bullet scorched past his shoulder, parting flesh and fabric in a line of liquid fire that drew a grunt from his lips but never slowed his movement toward the undercut bank, where ancient cottonwood roots created nature's own cathedral. "Can I hold you?" He whispered against her ear the familiar words, carrying new weight like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through the fabric of a moment that might be their last. She pressed closer, feeling the warmth of his blood seeping through cotton-tasting copper and fear on the air between them. "Always." She breathed the word, barely audible above chaos, yet somehow containing all the defiance her heart could muster against a world determined to tear them apart. They slipped into chest-deep water beneath the overhang, the cold shocking their systems like a baptism by ice, while they pressed against the muddy bank that smelled of secrets and decay. Above them, horses snorted and stamped, while Rattler's voice rang out with the authority of a man accustomed to breaking things until they served his purpose. "Search every reed bed, she's got to be here somewhere, and that Apache. Bring him to me breathing, if you can manage it. If not..." The rest dissolved into cruel laughter that sent shivers down Eliza's spine, hidden in their watery sanctuary. She felt Dasan's arm tighten around her waist as they held their breath, lungs burning while their hearts beat against each other, like birds trapped in the same cage. Through the curtain of hanging roots, they could see the legs of horses as riders spread along the bank, their mounts dancing nervously in ground that squelched with each step. Minutes stretched like years until the search moved away, hoofbeats fading into the gathering dusk that wrapped around them like a mourning shroud. When Dasan finally lifted her from their hiding place, his dark eyes held a mixture of tenderness and grim understanding, the look of a man who had just glimpsed his own mortality reflected in the eyes of the woman he loved. "Town." He said simply the single word, carrying volumes about safety and separation and the bitter mathematics of survival. "Stay where they can see you. Your shoulder, I've had worse." Already he was moving toward a riderless horse that had wandered close during the fight, vaulting onto its back, with that natural skill that made him seem part of the animal itself. Go. Now. Before she could voice the protest burning in her throat, he was galloping away across the marsh, deliberately drawing death after him with courage that made her heart break and soar in the same instant. She watched him disappear into the darkness that was swallowing the world, carrying her love and her terror with him into the dangerous night. Standing alone as evening settled around her like a familiar grief, Eliza pressed trembling fingers to the leather pouch at her waist. The papers within crackled softly, evidence that could expose corruption reaching from the territorial capital to this small valley, where honest people struggled to build lives worth living. But evidence was worthless if she died before dawn, and the battle for her inheritance had become something far larger, a war for the very soul of Willow Springs. 5 days earlier, trouble had arrived, wearing the respectable face of a public notice posted outside Murphy's General Store. Eliza had been wrestling with ledger books in the cramped backroom numbers that never seemed to balance properly, like everything else in a town slowly poisoning itself, when voices began rising in the street outside. Willow Springs occupied a valley where the river curved through stands of silver-green trees, a place suspended between two visions of the American frontier. On one side stood honest settlers like dried leaves, clinging to hope, trying to build lives worth passing to their children. On the other, crouched those who saw the vast territories as places where money and violence could purchase anything, including human souls. The notice bore Lucien Armand's elegant signature, announcing his intention to build a dam upstream for his Copper Gulch mine operations. What it carefully omitted was that the proposed site included the Willow Marsh land that Eliza had only recently discovered belonged to her through inheritance laws, as tangled as her feelings about claiming it. At 22, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that drew second glances without demanding them, auburn hair that caught sunlight like captured flame, and green eyes that held both determination and the particular sadness of someone who had buried too many dreams before their time. Her work as Murphy's bookkeeper paid little but offered independence in the small room above the haberdashery, where she kept her few possessions and too many memories. Her parents had died within 2 years of each other, her father crushed by poorly maintained mill machinery, her mother claimed by fever that might have been curable with better medicine and more money. They had left her nothing but memories and a brass locket that had belonged to Arthur McBride, her deceased fiancé, whose gentle soul had been the last good thing in her life before this terrible, wonderful complication named Dazen had walked out of the marsh like something from a dream she was afraid to remember. Arthur had been everything the world expected her to love. A decent man with calloused farmer's hands and a shy smile, someone who couldn't read or write, but loved her with the simple devotion of a faithful dog. His death 9 months earlier, in what Sheriff Tom Wakefield had ruled a tragic drowning, had closed the book on her expected future of modest happiness and respectable poverty. Sheriff Tom, Grinning Tom. To those who had learned to fear the smile that never quite reached his pale eyes, had declared Arthur's death accidental without bothering with inconveniences like investigation or evidence. Everyone in Willow Springs understood that he answered to Lucien Armand, rather than any abstract concept of justice, and Lucien's influence spread through the territory like a slow-acting poison. The mine owner was a man who wore silver hair and expensive Eastern clothes like armor against the frontier's rough democracy. His power flowed not merely from wealth, but from his willingness to employ men like Rattler human weapons who solved problems that money alone couldn't reach. From his grand house overlooking the valley, Lucien surveyed his domain with the satisfied air of a medieval lord who had never heard of concepts like equality or the consent of the governed. But corruption hadn't conquered every soul in Willow Springs. Dr. Malcolm Everett treated Apache and settler alike, despite the tremor in his left hand, a perpetual reminder of battlefield surgery performed, while Confederate artillery tried to relocate the hospital tent around him. His moral compass remained true even when his medical skills put him at odds with citizens who believed that healing the wrong people marked a man as dangerous. At 55, the doctor carried himself with the careful posture of someone whose body had been asked to bear more weight than God had intended. His words came measured and precise, shaped by education and sharpened by years of watching good people die for bad reasons. When he spoke of the war, which was rarely his voice, carried the particular weariness of a man who had learned that saving lives often required taking them first. Hannah Reed taught school with the fierce dedication of someone who viewed ignorance as humanity's greatest enemy. At 40, she had dedicated herself to education and what she called preserving truth against those who would bury it 6 feet deep. Her private ledger contained meticulous copies of every official document that passed through Willow Springs, creating an unofficial archive that might someday prove the difference between justice and the grave. Her words carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention from distracted children, but her eyes held depths that suggested she understood more about human nature than any schoolteacher should have to know. When she spoke of corruption, her voice took on the tone of a woman cataloging symptoms of a disease she recognized but couldn't cure. Emmett Doyle struggled to keep his farm afloat while raising 2 young sons, Timothy and Samuel, aged 8 and 10 respectively. His debt to Lucien Armand had transformed him from a proud farmer into something resembling a whipped dog, always glancing over his shoulder, always calculating the cost of honesty against the price of survival. Lately, his words had grown stilted in strange sentences that started confidently, but faltered midway, as if he were constantly editing himself before speaking. His eyes rarely met others directly anymore, and when they did, they carried the haunted look of a man who had seen himself in a mirror and found something unforgivable staring back. The revelation about Eliza's inheritance had emerged through Hannah's methodical research like a flower blooming in carefully tended soil. While cross-referencing property records for a mathematics lesson about land measurement, the schoolteacher had discovered that the marsh was listed under Martha Whitlow, Eliza's mother's maiden name, held in trust until her daughter reached majority. Your mother was a woman who thought beyond her own lifetime. Hannah had explained spreading documents across her kitchen table like battle plans. The deed includes riparian rights and something unusual, seasonal usage by those who camp peacefully on the eastern bank. That phrase may carry more weight than it appears. Eliza's relationship with Dasan had grown from a chance encounter that felt, in retrospect, like destiny wearing work clothes. She had found an injured hawk by the river, its wing hanging at an angle that made her heart ache with recognition of helpless pain. Dasan had appeared from the willows, as if summoned by her distress, showing her how to splint the bird's wing with strips of bark and patience that revealed depths of gentleness she had never associated with the Apache savages of frontier legend. Their friendship had deepened through small, careful exchanges cornmeal and dried fruit left by the old cottonwood in return for rabbit pelts and medicinal herbs that seemed to understand her body's needs better than any white doctor's remedies. These silent trades had gradually become spoken conversations, and conversations had blossomed into something more dangerous and precious than either had dared to hope for in a world that made their love a capital offense. Dasan worked as an army scout to provide for his small family group, walking a razor's edge between helping track hostile bands while protecting his people's sacred places and traditional roots. The position earned him suspicion from both sides, white soldiers who would never fully trust any Apache, and some of his own people who questioned whether survival was worth the price of cooperation. His words came sparingly, each one weighed and measured like a trader handling precious metal. When he spoke of the army, his voice carried no bitterness, only the flat acceptance of a man who had learned that the world's injustices were too large for any individual's anger to change. When he spoke of his people, warmth crept into his tone like sunrise touching stone. But when he spoke to Eliza, his voice became something else entirely soft, as leather worn smooth by countless careful hands, carrying undertones that spoke of futures he dared not name, but couldn't stop imagining. Their attraction had grown slowly built on shared moments of understanding that transcended the artificial barriers their respective worlds had erected. Both knew the dangers interracial relationships could mean a rope for him and exile for her. Yet something in their connection made those risks feel like small prices to pay for what they had found in each other's arms. Now, with Lucian's dam threatening to destroy both the marsh and the town's water supply, their private world was colliding with public battles that would test not merely their love, but their courage to stand against forces that had crushed stronger people than they. The break-in at Hannah's schoolhouse occurred 3 nights after Lucian's announcement, when a moonless sky provided perfect cover for men who moved with the professional efficiency of experienced thieves. Hannah had been grading arithmetic papers by lamplight, finding small satisfaction in her students' growing mastery of fractions, when the sound of metal working against the front door lock sent ice through her veins. Moving with the instinctive quiet of someone who had spent 20 years managing classrooms full of mischievous children, she extinguished her lamp and crept to the window. 3 shadowy figures searched her classroom with purpose, their movements coordinated like those of men who had performed similar tasks before. One headed straight for her desk, while the others systematically ransacked filing cabinets containing copies of every official document that had passed through Willow Springs. Her heart began racing like a trapped bird as she realized they were after her ledger, the meticulous record that served as the town's unofficial memory, and the only backup for information certain people would prefer to see turned to ash. Without pausing to consider consequences, she struck a match and relit her lamp, holding it high, so the sudden flare would blaze through every window like an accusation. "They helped thieves in the school, someone help me." The intruders froze for a heartbeat, then bolted like startled deer. In their panicked haste, one man's sleeve caught on a protruding nail, tearing away an expensive leather glove that fell unnoticed to the floor, a small piece of evidence that would later prove more valuable than gold. She heard boots pounding down the front steps and horses galloping into darkness, their hoofbeats fading like thunder rolling away from a past storm. When Sheriff Tom arrived 20 minutes later, his characteristic grin seemed wider than usual, stretching his face into something that might have been humor if it hadn't been carved from ice. He made an elaborate show of examining the scene, while displaying about as much genuine interest in catching culprits as a cat shows in learning arithmetic. Probably just drifters looking for something valuable to steal. He said, with the casual dismissal of a man accustomed to explaining away inconvenient crimes. The torn glove disappeared into his vest pocket, with the smooth efficiency of a magician making evidence vanish. "I'll keep this safe as evidence naturally. Wouldn't want it getting lost." His pale eyes met Hannah's with a message as clear as printed words. Some evidence had a way of disappearing when it might prove embarrassing to important people. The next morning found Eliza standing in Sheriff Tom's office, holding her copied deed like a talisman against the corruption that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. She had hoped that official recognition of her ownership might prevent illegal seizure of the marshland. But Tom's smile as he listened to her carefully prepared explanation made her stomach clench with growing dread. "Well now, Miss Whitlow, that's quite an interesting story you're telling," he said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of a man addressing a slow child. "Let me just file this properly with the other territorial claims that crossed my desk." Horror flooded through her like ice water as he opened the office stove and fed her precious papers to flames that consumed 9 months of hope in less time than it took to draw breath. His grin widened as evidence of her inheritance turned to worthless ash, his satisfaction so complete it seemed to fill the room like smoke. "Oops. Clumsy of me, I suppose." His voice held no more regret than a man might feel for stepping on an ant. "But I'm sure an intelligent young lady like yourself understands that some old claims don't hold much water anymore, especially when there's important development at stake for the betterment of our entire community. That was legal proof of my ownership. Was it funny thing about memory, Miss Whitlow? I don't recall seeing any such document cross my desk today." His pale eyes grew cold as winter stars, and when he smiled now, She could see something hungry moving behind his teeth. But I do seem to recall that young ladies who make unnecessary trouble for important businessmen sometimes find themselves in most unfortunate situations. Accidents have a way of happening to troublemakers. Just ask your departed fiancé about that. Oh wait, you can't, can you? The threat hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and replacing it with the taste of copper and fear. She left the office knowing that official channels would provide no help, and that she was now marked as an enemy by men who collected enemies the way other people collected debts. That afternoon, walking home from Murphy's store through streets that suddenly felt like a trap. Waiting to spring, Eliza noticed she was being followed. Two of Rattler's men maintained careful distance, but made their presence felt like a constant itch between her shoulder blades, matching her pace with the patience of vultures circling wounded prey. When she quickened her step, they matched her rhythm exactly. When she ducked into Murphy's store for the second time, claiming she had forgotten something essential, they waited outside with the endless patience of men paid to be thorough. It was Dasan who provided escape, appearing beside her in the alley behind Murphy's, with that silent grace she had come to love, like a favorite hymn. He moved like smoke, given form his weathered buckskin jacket, blending with evening shadows, as if the world itself conspired to hide him. This way, he murmured, his voice barely louder than wind, through grass guiding her toward the river path, with the gentle authority of someone who knew every stone and route between town and safety. Later that night, they met beneath the old cottonwood, where their relationship had first taken root in soil watered by secrecy and hope. Dasan examined her hands for injuries, with the careful attention of someone checking a precious instrument for damage, then produced a small metal tag from his pocket with the satisfied air of a hunter presenting proof of a successful stalk. CGM, Copper Gulch Mine, he said, placing the stamped brass disc in her palm, where it seemed to burn like a coal fresh from hell's own forge. Took this from one of their horses while they were busy watching you. Now you have proof that Lucian's men were following you on direct orders. Eliza studied the tag by moonlight, tracing raised letters that seemed to spell out her own death warrant. Hannah was right to suspect the break-in. They're not just trying to steal my land, they're systematically destroying any evidence that might stand against them. It's worse than simple theft. Dasan's voice carried the weight of hard-won knowledge, each word dropping into the silence between them, like stones into deep water. I scouted their dam site today. They're not planning to just block the river, they want to divert most of the water flow directly to mining operations. The downstream flow will drop to almost nothing during dry season. The implications hit her like stones thrown by an angry child, each one finding its mark with painful precision. They're not just stealing land. They're planning to strangle the life out of Willow Springs itself. Your town will die slowly. Dasan agreed, his dark eyes reflecting starlight like pools of captured night. People will be forced to work for Lucian under whatever terms he chooses, or abandon everything they've built and start over somewhere else, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. As they talked, working out the desperate beginnings of resistance against forces that seemed as immovable as mountains, neither noticed the figure watching from distant tree cover. Quiet Will, an Apache scout driven by poverty to accept blood money for information, had been tracking through the area when he spotted the couple by the water. Men working for Lucien Armand had already approached him with offers that his starving family couldn't afford to refuse. And the sight of Dasan holding the white woman with such obvious tenderness was worth more silver than Quiet Will had seen in a year of honest work. By morning, word would reach Rattler that the Apache scout had developed personal interest in protecting the woman who claimed ownership of the marshland. The hunt that had begun with legal documents and bureaucratic pressure was about to become something far deadlier. Dawn broke gray and threatening over Willow Springs' heavy clouds, promising the kind of sudden downpours that could turn dusty streets into rivers of mud and honest intentions into disasters. Emmett Doyle arrived at Dr. Everett's clinic as the first fat raindrops began painting dark circles on the wooden steps, his face carrying the expression of a man who had spent the night wrestling with demons and lost. "Hot, Doc, I need to speak with you," he said, his voice coming in fits and starts like a machine with broken gears. His eyes darted constantly toward shadows, as if expecting accusers to emerge from every corner. And the others too, if you can gather them. About what Rattler's planning for tomorrow. Dr. Everett looked up from the medical supplies he was organizing with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that chaos killed more efficiently than bullets. Years of reading pain in human faces had taught him to recognize when someone was carrying a burden too heavy for one soul to bear alone. "Hannah's already here in the back room," the doctor said, nodding toward the rear of the clinic where lamplight flickered like a candle in a shrine. "And Eliza should arrive soon. I sent word that we needed to discuss the situation that's been developing around the land ownership." When all four were gathered around Dr. Everett's examination table, the closest thing to a war council table they possessed, Emmett shared what his cursed position as one of Lucian's debtors had taught him. His obligation to perform occasional services for the mine owner had given him access to information that could either save them all or see them buried in unmarked graves before the week was out. Now Rattler's planning to grab Miss Whitlow at tomorrow's market. He whispered the words, seeming to cost him physical pain to speak. Each syllable came out like blood from a wound that wouldn't heal. "He's got orders to make her sign over the marshland, and he's not particularly concerned about the methods he might need to employ. And if she refuses to cooperate?" The implications hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre, and too terrible to speak aloud, but too real to ignore. Hannah leaned forward, her teacher's mind, already dissecting the problem with the systematic approach she brought to difficult mathematical proofs. "We need the original deed, not just my copied version, but the actual document that was filed with territorial authorities. If it still exists, it would be stored in the church strongbox, along with other historical records that predate the current corruption. Pastor Williams keeps that strongbox locked tighter than his conscience," Dr. Everett pointed out, though his tone suggested he was already considering possibilities rather than obstacles. His battlefield experience had taught him that impossible situations sometimes yielded to desperate measures. "I know where he hides a spare key." Hannah admitted, her cheeks coloring slightly with the confession. "I've helped him with record-keeping before, and he's getting on in years, and his memory isn't what it used to be. But getting into the church during a storm like this..." She gestured toward a windows where rain was beginning to fall with increasing determination. The plan that emerged from their hushed discussion was born of desperation and necessity in equal measure. While Dasan and Eliza attempted to break into the church during the storm's cover, Dr. Everett would position himself strategically at tomorrow's market with his medical bag and the service revolver he hadn't touched since Appomattox, a weapon that still carried the weight of too many memories and not enough absolution. Hannah would station herself at the schoolhouse bell, ready to sound an alarm that would bring help from every corner of Willow Springs if violence erupted in the bright light of market day. The storm struck with the fury of divine judgment shortly after midnight, transforming Willow Springs into a maze of streaming water and lightning-carved shadows. Thunder rolled across the valley like artillery barrages from Dr. Everett's nightmares, while rain fell with such violence that it seemed to be trying to wash away not just dirt, but sin itself. The church's spare key was exactly where Hannah had indicated, hidden beneath a loose stone near the back entrance, with the trust of a simpler time when locks were suggestions rather than necessities. But the heavy wooden door had swollen from moisture like a wound that refused to heal, requiring both Eliza and Dasan to put their combined weight against oak that seemed determined to keep its secrets. Inside, the sanctuary felt vast and threatening. filled with the percussion of rain drumming against wooden shingles and the whisper of wind through gaps that had never been properly sealed. Lightning flashes through stained glass windows cast brief explosions of colored light across walls that had heard more confessions than they had prayers, creating a kaleidoscope of beauty and menace that made every shadow seem alive with possibility. They found their prize in the strongbox, the original deed wrapped in oiled cloth, like a relic from a more honest age, signed by Martha Whitlow, in ink that had faded but not surrendered, witnessed by church officials, whose signatures still carried the authority of men who had believed their word meant something. Seasonal usage by those who camped peacefully on the eastern bank. Eliza read by the flickering light of Dasan's carefully shielded lantern, her voice barely audible above the storm's fury. Your family group when they passed through during winter months. Your mother understood more about the future than most people understand about the present. Dasan observed his voice, carrying a note of something that might have been wonder if he had allowed himself such luxuries. But as they prepared to leave with their precious burden, the sound of approaching horses cut through the storm's noise, like blades through silk. Multiple riders were approaching the church, too many for coincidence, too coordinated for accident. 3 figures entered the sanctuary with spurs that jingled softly against stone floors worn smooth by generations of worshippers. Rattler and 2 of his men moved through the sacred space with the casual irreverence of wolves prowling through a sheepfold, their presence transforming the church into something that felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. Check the strongbox first. Rattler ordered, his voice echoing off vaulted ceilings with the authority of a man accustomed to having his commands obeyed without question. If that deed still exists anywhere on God's green earth, we burn it tonight and solve this problem permanently. Eliza's hand moved instinctively to the pouch where she had secreted the precious document, feeling the crinkle of paper that might as well have been her own death warrant. They had found their evidence just in time, but now they were trapped in consecrated ground with the very men who would kill them for possessing it. Dasan pointed toward a side door that led to the pastor's private study, then indicated the window beyond, with movements as economical as his words. If they could reach that exit without detection, they might escape into the storm that had provided cover for their desperate mission. Moving with the infinite care of people whose lives depended on absolute silence, they began working their way along the wall toward possible salvation. Eliza's wet dress dripped steadily, but the sound was completely masked by rain hammering overhead and the occasional crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. They had nearly reached the study door when a particularly brilliant lightning flash illuminated the entire sanctuary, like the flash of a photographer's bulb, and one of Rattler's men spotted movement near the altar where no movement should have been. "Boss, we got company in here." The gunfire that followed was deafening in the enclosed space muzzle flashes, strobing like the devil's own fireworks, while wooden splinters flew from pews like angry wasps. Dasan grabbed Eliza's hand, and they ran desperately for the study door, reaching it just as Rattler's voice rose above the chaos with the frustrated fury of a predator whose prey had proven more elusive than expected. "Don't let them escape. That deed dies here tonight, and them with it if necessary." They crashed through the study window in a shower of glass and blessed rain, landing hard in mud that tasted of earth and possibilities, while lightning illuminated their escape like nature's own benediction. Dasan's shoulder, wound from their earlier encounter, tore open again, sending fresh blood down his arm in warm streams that mixed with rainwater and ran red into soil that had absorbed too much violence already. But he kept moving without complaint, pulling Eliza with him toward the safety of trees that seemed to welcome them like old friends returning from a long and dangerous journey. Behind them, they could hear Rattler cursing with the creative profanity of a man whose carefully laid plans had been disrupted by weather and determination in equal measure. The storm that had made their break-in possible had also provided their salvation, transforming what should have been a deadly trap into a narrow escape that left them battered but breathing. Yet, as they reached the tree line and relative safety, both understood that the easy part of their ordeal was behind them. Tomorrow would bring market day, and the real test of whether courage and evidence could stand against money and violence when the stakes were measured in innocent lives. Market day dawned bright and clear, as if the previous night's storm had washed the world clean for the confrontation that everyone could feel approaching like a fever in the blood. The usual festive atmosphere that accompanied weekly trading felt strained and artificial like laughter at a funeral, as word had spread through Willow Springs about the escalating tensions surrounding Lucian's dam project. Townspeople gathered with the careful movements of people who sensed that violence might erupt at any moment, their conversations too quiet and their glances too frequent toward the surrounding hills where everyone knew dangerous men waited for orders that might come with the morning sun. Dr. Everett positioned himself strategically near the vegetable stalls, his medical bag resting at his feet, and his coat carefully arranged to conceal the service revolver he had reluctantly strapped beneath his arm. The weapon felt heavier than memory suggested, weighted not just with metal, but with recollections of a war that had taught him the difference between killing and murder was often measured in degrees too small for civilian understanding. His left hand shook more than usual, not just from old memories of battlefield surgery performed while enemy artillery tried to relocate the hospital tent, but from the knowledge that he might soon be called upon to take life rather than preserve it. The irony wasn't lost on him that his medical oath might require violence to fulfill its ultimate purpose. Hannah Reed examined fabric samples with elaborate care, while keeping one watchful eye on the bell rope that could summon help from every corner of Willow Springs, if circumstances demanded it. Her teacher's instincts, honed by 20 years of managing classrooms full of unpredictable children, kept her alert for the subtle signs that preceded chaos, the way conversations died too quickly, the manner in which people positioned themselves near exits, the quality of silence that suggested everyone was holding their breath. Emmett had brought Timothy and Samuel to town, ostensibly for weekly supplies, but in reality to provide additional witnesses to whatever was about to unfold in the bright morning sunlight. The boys stayed close to their father, with the instinctive awareness that children possess for adult tensions they don't understand but recognize as dangerous. The attack, when it came, arrived without fanfare or warning violence, wearing the mask of routine, until the mask slipped and revealed teeth beneath. Eliza was examining preserved fruit at Mrs. Patterson's stall, her mind half focused on domestic concerns and half alert for danger when strong hands seized her from behind with the practiced efficiency of men who had performed similar tasks before. "Let me go," she shouted, driving her elbow backward into ribs that felt solid as oak, while kicking at shins with her boot heels. Her teeth found the hand attempting to muffle her cries, drawing blood and creative profanity from the man trying to drag her toward a wagon that waited like a hearse in the side street. The struggle attracted attention with the speed of wildfire, jumping between dry trees. Hannah's bell began ringing in sharp, urgent clangs that cut through market noise like an accusation, summoning help from every direction, while Dr. Everett moved toward the disturbance, with his hand instinctively seeking the comfort of cold metal beneath his coat. Rattler himself materialized beside the wagon, his scarred face twisted into an expression that suggested he had moved beyond impatience into something approaching artistic fury. Instead of his usual revolver, he had drawn a long knife, clearly intending to avoid the sound of gunshots that would bring immediate help from every armed citizen within hearing distance. "Stop fighting, girl, unless you want to spend the rest of your very short life explaining to St. Peter why your friends had to die because of your stubbornness," he snarled, pressing the blade against Eliza's forearm, with enough pressure to part skin and draw a thin line of blood that looked black in the morning light. The steel was cold as winter against her flesh, but the threat in his voice was colder still. "You're going to sign papers transferring that marshland to Mr. Armand. And you're going to do it with a smile that convinces everyone watching that this is exactly what you wanted to do all along. Or tomorrow morning, folks are going to be fishing your schoolteacher friend and that shaky-handed doctor out of the river, assuming we leave enough of them to float." Before Eliza could formulate any response to threats that turned her blood to ice, Dr. Everett's voice cut through the tension with the quiet authority of a man who had learned command on battlefields, where hesitation measured the difference between victory and massacre. Release her immediately, or I'll demonstrate the difference between medicine and surgery. The doctor stood 20 feet away, his service revolver held in both hands to compensate for the trembling that made precise aim uncertain at the best of times. The weapon wavered slightly in his grip, but at this range, even an unsteady shot would prove devastatingly effective. And everyone present understood the mathematics of violence well enough to calculate their odds. Rattler's laugh held all the warmth of December wind through bare branches. "You planning to shoot me in front of all these good Christian witnesses, Doc? That doesn't seem entirely consistent with that medical oath you swore back when the world was young and you still believed in happy endings. My oath is to preserve life." Dr. Everett replied with the steady conviction of a man who had spent years reconciling moral complexity with practical necessity. Sometimes preservation requires amputation. Sometimes it requires more drastic interventions. The standoff stretched between them like a wire drawn too tight, with market-goers pressing back to give the armed men room while Hannah continued ringing the bell with the methodical persistence of someone calling the faithful to worship or war. Then Emmett stepped forward with his hunting rifle cradled in weathered hands that remained steady despite the fear everyone could see written across his face. "Let her go, Rattler. This madness has gone far enough already." His voice carried the flat conviction of a man who had finally reached the place where retreat was no longer possible. The appearance of a second weapon shifted the balance decisively in favor of justice over intimidation. Additional townspeople were moving their hands toward their own firearms, and the mood of the crowd was transforming from curiosity to something approaching righteous anger as people began to understand exactly what they were witnessing. With a string of curses that would have made a drunken soldier blush with shame, Rattler shoved Eliza away from him with unnecessary violence. But his knife hand moved as he released her, opening a longer cut on her forearm, not deep enough to be immediately dangerous, but sufficient to send a message about the price of continued resistance. "This conversation isn't finished." He snarled his pale eyes, moving from face to face like a man cataloging targets for future reference. "Tomorrow those papers get signed with ink, or blood, makes no difference to me which. And if I were you folks, I'd start giving serious thought to the safety of those two boys over there." His gaze fixed on Timothy and Samuel with unmistakable threat, making both children press closer to their father, while their young faces went white with instinctive terror. Emmett's jaw tightened until tendons stood out like rope under strain. But his rifle never wavered from its target. "Touch my sons and I'll kill you myself," he said quietly, and everyone present could hear the absolute sincerity that turned the words into a promise rather than a threat. Rattler and his men withdrew under the hostile stares of what had become an armed and angry crowd. But the damage to any pretense of civilized discourse was complete. The confrontation had become utterly public, and everyone in Willow Springs now understood that the conflict over marshland ownership had moved far beyond legal disputes into the realm of open violence and deadly intimidation. That afternoon, while Dr. Everett cleaned and bandaged Eliza's knife wound with the gentle efficiency of hands that had treated worse injuries under far worse conditions, their small group gathered in his clinic to plan increasingly desperate next moves. The immediate crisis had passed, but Rattler's specific threat against innocent children meant they were rapidly running out of time for subtle approaches or legal maneuvering. "We need to get this evidence to territorial authorities as quickly as humanly possible," Hannah said, consulting her comprehensive ledger with the systematic approach she brought to all problems. "There's a federal marshal scheduled to pass through Copper Gulch sometime within the next week, assuming his circuit hasn't been disrupted by weather or Apache troubles. Next week might be too late for all of us," Dasan pointed out with a blunt honesty that characterized his approach to uncomfortable truths. He had arrived through the clinic's back door to avoid the main street where his presence with Eliza might attract unwanted attention from citizens who viewed interracial relationships as threats to the natural order. They're accelerating the dam construction schedule dramatically. If they can present it as a completed project, the legal challenges become exponentially more difficult to sustain. Eliza winced as the doctor tightened the bandage around her wounded arm, but her voice remained steady and determined when she spoke. Then, we need to stop the construction directly and immediately. What would it actually take to prove conclusively that Lucian's permits are completely fraudulent, witnesses to the illegal activities? Hannah replied methodically, her teacher's mind, organizing the problem into manageable components. Documentation of the systematic bribery and intimidation that's been poisoning our local government. And most crucially, we need to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Sheriff Tom is actively complicit in the entire conspiracy. It was Emmett who provided the information they needed, though his obvious reluctance made every word seem to cost him something essential. The guilt that had been eating him alive for months was written in every line of his weathered face. And when he spoke, his voice carried the hollow quality of a man confessing sins that had grown too heavy for one soul to bear. There's a document shipment going out tomorrow night. He admitted the words, seeming to cause him physical pain. Papers and records that Lucian wants moved out of the territory permanently before they can be subpoenaed by federal investigators. They're planning to use the late train to Denver, the one that doesn't make regular stops and doesn't ask inconvenient questions about cargo manifests. What kind of documents are we discussing? Dr. Everett asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be pleasant. The kind that would prove Hannah's absolutely correct about the systematic bribery and falsified permits. Emmett confessed his inability to meet anyone's eyes, directly speaking volumes about the shame consuming him. Financial records showing payments to territorial officials, correspondence documenting agreements that were never meant to see daylight evidence of mineral theft, on a scale that would make highway robbery look like petty pilfering. I was supposed to help load them onto the train myself, but his gaze moved to his sons, who were playing quietly in the corner with wooden toys that Dr. Everett kept for young patients. I can't keep doing his dirty work anymore. Not when innocent children are being used as leverage against their own parents. Not when I look at Timothy and Samuel and see Arthur McBride's face staring back at me. The pain in his voice was raw enough to make everyone in the room uncomfortable. But it was pain that carried the seeds of redemption if he could find the courage to nurture them properly. The plan that emerged from their hushed discussion was necessarily risky, but potentially decisive. They would attempt to intercept the document shipment at the railroad crossing outside town, where trains were forced to slow for a sharp curve that engineers had never bothered to correct. If they could recover the papers that Lucian was desperately trying to destroy, they would possess evidence sufficient to expose the entire conspiracy to federal authorities who had the power to act on it. But as evening shadows began lengthening toward what might be their final confrontation, smoke started rising ominously from multiple locations throughout Willow Springs. Through the clinic windows, they could see orange flames already consuming buildings that had served as their headquarters and sanctuary throughout this escalating crisis. They're not just burning us out. Dr. Everett observed with grim understanding, watching years of medical practice and irreplaceable supplies disappear into smoke that stung his eyes and nose. They're systematically destroying anything that might serve as evidence against them, along with anyone who might be brave enough or foolish enough to testify. The fires spread with suspicious coordination and speed through wooden structures that had been dried by summer heat and prepared with what appeared to be deliberate accelerants. Dr. Everett ran toward the flames, consuming his clinic, desperate to save instruments and the written witness statements they had painstakingly collected, but the intense heat drove him back with singed eyebrows and lungs full of smoke that tasted of everything he had worked to build. Hannah and Eliza pulled him away from the burning buildings, while Desan fired carefully aimed warning shots at shadows moving with suspicious purpose in nearby alleys. The shots were deliberately intended to wound rather than kill too many innocent families lived in those houses for indiscriminate gunfire to be acceptable, even in the midst of what was clearly becoming a war for the town's survival. As buildings collapsed in spectacular showers of sparks and glowing embers that drifted through the air like fallen stars, their small group realized they had lost not just their base of operations, but much of the carefully documented evidence they had gathered. The fires had been precisely calculated to destroy their resources, while forcing them into a premature confrontation they weren't adequately prepared for. They're hurting us exactly where they want us. Dasan observed with the tactical awareness that had kept him alive in conflicts where survival often depended on understanding your enemy's strategy better than your own. Into the hills away from witnesses, and help where they can resolve this situation permanently without worrying about inconvenient questions from territorial authorities. But even as defeat seemed to be closing around them like smoke from the burning buildings, salvation arrived in the form of a confession that had been 9 months in the making. The truth came with dawn, delivered through lips that trembled with the weight of secrets that had been poisoning a good man's soul since the day Arthur McBride died. Emmett Doyle stood among the ruins of what had been Dr. Everett's clinic, clutching something wrapped in dirty cloth like a relic from a life he was finally ready to leave behind. I can't carry this burden for another day. He whispered, his voice breaking like a dam that had been weakened by time and pressure until it could no longer hold back the flood. This belonged to Arthur McBride, and he died because of what I did. He unwrapped the object with trembling hands, revealing a pocket watch, whose brass case had been dented and stained with dried mud that spoke of violence and hasty burial. Eliza felt the world shift beneath her feet as she recognized the timepiece she had given Arthur for his birthday, the one he had promised to carry always as proof of their love and commitment to a future that had been stolen from them. She reached for it with fingers that shook like autumn leaves, turning it over to see her own initial still clearly engraved on the back, exactly as she remembered. The metal was cold against her palm, but it seemed to burn her fingers with the heat of truth too long denied. Where did you get this? Dr. Everett asked, his medical training helping him maintain composure, even as he sensed that everything they thought they knew about Arthur's death was about to be revealed as a carefully constructed lie. Emmett's voice cracked completely as words began tumbling out in a torrent of guilt and pain that had been building pressure for 9 months. Arthur didn't drown accidentally. God help me, but he didn't die because the sluice gates malfunctioned or because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He died because I killed him on Lucian's orders. The clinic ruins fell silent, except for the sound of Hannah's pen clattering to the ground and Dasan's sharp intake of breath. Even the morning birds seemed to pause in their singing, as if nature itself was holding its breath to hear the full scope of this confession. Lucian's foreman, Greasy Pete, came to my farm one morning and told me I had a choice to make. Emmett continued, tears streaming down his weathered face, like rain down a mountainside carved by too much erosion. I could open the upstream sluice gates at exactly the time he specified, or I could watch my farm get foreclosed and my boys get sent to territorial orphanages where children disappear and nobody asks uncomfortable questions about where they might have gone. His voice dissolved into sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. I thought, God help me, I honestly thought the lower channel would be empty when the water came down. I had no idea Arthur was working below the gates that morning. No idea at all. Dr. Everett's hand moved instinctively toward the medical bag. He no longer possessed the gesture automatic and useless, but somehow necessary. His voice carried the gentle tone he used with patients whose injuries were beyond his skill to heal. Tell us what happened, Emmett. All of it. Arthur was working on the loading platform, checking the support structures like he did every morning before the crews arrived. Emmett said, his words coming faster now, as if speed might somehow lessen their impact. When he saw me up on the control platform, he waved and smiled, that friendly, trusting smile he always had for everyone. He called out something about what a beautiful morning it was for honest work. The image hung in the air between them, like a painting of innocence about to be destroyed by forces it couldn't comprehend or defend against. The water hit him like a stampeding horse, Emmett whispered. One moment he was standing there waving at me, and the next he was gone. Swept away so fast he didn't even have time to scream. Didn't even have time to understand what was happening to him. Eliza sank onto a piece of charred timber, the watch pressed against her chest as if she could somehow absorb Arthur's spirit through the metal that had been closest to his heart when he died. The gentle man she had loved, who couldn't read or write, but had been teaching himself in secret, wanting to surprise her with letters written in his own careful hand, had been murdered to protect illegal mining operations that valued silver more than human life. I pulled his body out of the water downstream that night. Emmett continued with devastating honesty. Greasy Pete said we had to make it look like a pure accident, so I moved him to the main channel where Sheriff Tom would find him the next morning. Made it appear like he'd been caught by a sudden water release during normal mining operations that nobody could have predicted or prevented. You've been living with this knowledge for 9 months. Dr. Everett's voice held compassion rather than judgment, recognizing the psychological torture that such guilt could inflict on a fundamentally decent man's conscience. Every single night. Emmett confirmed, his voice hollow as an empty grave. Every time I look at my boys, I see Arthur's face in that last moment when the water hit him. I told myself I was protecting my family, but I was really just protecting myself from facing what I had become. From admitting that I had traded another man's life for my own convenience. Hannah leaned forward, her schoolteacher's mind already working through the implications with the methodical precision she brought to complex problems. This means Lucian has been using premeditated murder to protect his illegal operations for at least 9 months. And if he was willing to kill Arthur to prevent him from reporting suspicious activities, then he'll kill anyone else who threatens to expose him. Dasan finished with the blunt honesty that characterized his approach to unpleasant truths, including every person standing in these ruins right now. The revelation transformed their understanding of the situation completely. What had begun as a property dispute over marshland was now revealed as part of a larger pattern of violence and systematic corruption that reached back nearly a year and might extend far beyond their small community. What exactly did Arthur discover that made him dangerous enough to murder? Eliza asked, her voice barely audible, as she struggled to process the magnitude of betrayal and loss that had been hidden beneath 9 months of carefully constructed lies. Emmett reached into his coat pocket with hands that shook like leaves in a strong wind. He'd been working the ore-loading platforms, helping move the heavy wagons filled with raw material from the mining operations. Started asking questions about why so much high-grade ore was being shipped out during night shifts without any of the proper documentation required by territorial mining laws. He produced a small leather-bound ledger, whose pages were filled with Arthur's painstaking attempts at writing letters formed by a man who had been teaching himself literacy in secret, driven by love and the desire to surprise the woman he planned to marry with his growing education. Arthur figured out that the numbers didn't match. Emmett explained, opening the book to reveal columns of figures written in Arthur's careful hand. Too much raw material was going into the mining operations, but nowhere near enough processed ore was being officially recorded as output. He started documenting everything he observed: dates, times, wagon weights, shipment destinations, unusual activities during the night shifts, when most people weren't around to witness what was happening. Eliza took the ledger with hands that trembled with a mixture of grief and growing understanding. Each page revealed Arthur's dedication to uncovering the truth, his methodical approach to gathering evidence, and his determination to do the right thing regardless of personal cost. The entries showed systematic theft over many months, with specific details about nighttime shipments and falsified records that would be invaluable evidence in any federal investigation. He was learning to read and write because he wanted to write me letters. She whispered, recognizing the profound love that had motivated his secret education. He wanted to surprise me with his progress, maybe write me poetry or love letters that no one else would ever see. The irony was bitter enough to taste like copper on her tongue. Arthur had planned to report his concerns about the mining irregularities to Sheriff Tom, completely unaware that Tom was already being paid handsomely to ensure such concerns never reached territorial authorities. His honest intentions and desire to protect his community had effectively signed his own death warrant. This ledger, combined with Hannah's documentation, gives us enough evidence to bring down Lucian's entire operation. Dr. Everett observed, though his tone suggested he understood, that possessing evidence and living long enough to present it were two entirely different challenges. But even as hope flickered like a candle flame in darkness, the harsh reality of their situation became increasingly clear. Lucian had already demonstrated his willingness to commit murder to protect his secrets, and he wouldn't hesitate to kill again and again and again to prevent exposure. The evidence they had gathered made them all targets, and the children they were trying to protect were now in greater danger than ever before. He knows about our relationship now, Dasan said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won knowledge about how information traveled in small communities where everyone's business eventually became everyone else's concern. Quiet Will has been watching our meetings and reporting back to Lucian's men for money he needed to feed his own family. Our secret isn't secret anymore, which means Lucian understands exactly how to inflict maximum pain on both of us. The trap was closing around them with mathematical precision. Their forbidden love was now public knowledge, which meant Lucian possessed leverage that could be used to control either of them through threats against the other. The very thing that had given their lives meaning and hope had become the weapon their enemies would use to destroy them. They'll use me to control you. Eliza understood with crystalline clarity. And they'll use you to control me. We've given them the key to breaking us both. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm them like floodwater rising around a house built too close to the river, they heard footsteps approaching through the ruins. All of them tensed hands, moving instinctively toward whatever weapons they possessed, until a familiar figure emerged from the smoke-hazed morning light. Quiet Will stood at the edge of what had been Dr. Everett's clinic, his weathered face carrying an expression that none of them had seen before, something that looked like shame and determination mixed together in proportions that suggested a man who had finally reached the point where survival wasn't worth the price being asked for it. "I heard everything," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the hollow quality of a man who had looked into a mirror and found something unforgivable staring back at him. "I was coming to warn you about what Rattler's planning, but I arrived in time to hear the farmer's confession about the murdered man." His admission came in halting phrases that seemed to cost him something essential with each word. For months, he had been accepting payment from Lucian's men to watch Dasan and report on his movements and associations. He had told them about the secret meetings by the river and the developing relationship between the Apache scout and the white woman who owned the disputed marshland. "My family was starving," he said, unable to meet Dasan's eyes directly. "The Army only provides payment when there's active scouting work available, and this winter was harder than most. I told myself it was just harmless information that nobody would actually get hurt because of what I reported. But people did get hurt," Hannah said quietly, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had dedicated her life to distinguishing between right and wrong. "And now, innocent children are in mortal danger because of the information you sold." Quiet Will nodded miserably, his shoulders sagging under a weight that silver could never lift. "I can't undo what I've done, but I can help stop what's coming next if you'll let me try." I know every tunnel and hiding place in those hills where they're holding the children. I know Rattler's plans and his weaknesses. But you need to understand, what's coming next is a trap designed specifically for all of you." As he spoke, smoke continued rising from the systematic destruction of their resources and safe havens. But in his words, they heard the first stirrings of hope they had felt since this nightmare began. Redemption, it seemed, sometimes arrived, wearing the face of betrayal, seeking to make amends. The kidnapping unfolded at high noon when the merciless sun beat down on the hayfield where Timothy and Samuel Doyle helped their father gather the last of the summer cutting. The boys had been laughing as they chased grasshoppers through dried stalks, their innocent voices carrying across the open ground like music that seemed to mock the darkness gathering around their small family. Emmett spotted the riders approaching from nearly a mile away, 5 men on horseback moving with the purposeful determination of hunters who had finally located their intended prey. He dropped his scythe immediately and called to his sons, but the boys were too far away and too absorbed in their play to hear him over the sound of their own laughter and the whisper of wind through grain. "Timothy, Samuel, come here right now." The desperate urgency in his voice finally penetrated their childhood absorption, but by then it was already too late. Rattler and his men had surrounded the boys with tactical precision, their horses forming an inescapable circle that cut off any possibility of flight. The children stood frozen with absolute terror, clutching each other while their young faces went white as freshly fallen snow. Emmett ran across the field with his heart hammering against his rib like a trapped bird, watching his worst nightmare unfold in bright sunlight that made every detail painfully clear. Sweat poured down his face, whether from exertion or fear he couldn't tell. But each step seemed to take forever while covering no distance at all. "Let them go," he shouted, arriving breathless and desperate at the circle of mounted men whose faces showed about as much compassion as carved stone. "Take me instead. They're just innocent children who don't understand what any of this is about." Rattler sat easily in his saddle, a coiled rope in his hands, and that familiar cold smile playing across his scarred features like frost forming on window glass. His pale eyes held the calculating look of a man who had discovered exactly the right pressure point to apply maximum pain. "Should have thought about potential consequences before you decided to develop a conscience, Emmett," he said with the casual cruelty of someone discussing weather rather than human lives. "Should have considered what your sudden attack of honesty might cost the people you claim to love most in this world." The boys pressed closer together, Samuel's tears streaming down his dirt-stained face, while Timothy tried desperately to be brave, despite fear that made his small body tremble like a leaf in a hurricane. Their terror was so profound, it seemed to create its own atmosphere around them, thick and suffocating and absolutely heartbreaking to witness. What do you want from me?" Emmett demanded, though he already knew the answer would involve betraying everything he had finally found the courage to stand for. Simple mathematics. Rattler replied with the satisfied air of a man holding all the winning cards in a game where the stakes were measured in innocent blood. "Your boy's continued health in exchange for Miss Whitlow's signature on land transfer papers. Plus your continued silence about certain unfortunate accidents that might have occurred near sluice gates. Seems like a reasonable trade from where I'm sitting." Before Emmett could formulate any response to demands that turned his blood to ice water, one of Rattler's men leaned down from his saddle and clubbed him viciously across the back of the head with a rifle butt. Emmett dropped to his knees, in the soft earth blood immediately beginning to trickle from his scalp as his vision blurred and his balance completely deserted him. Through the ringing in his ears that sounded like church bells played by a madman, he could hear his sons crying out for him with voices that seemed to come from very far away. Papa, please get up. Don't hurt him anymore." Timothy shouted with 8-year-old courage that would have made any father proud under different circumstances. "He didn't do anything wrong to you people." Rattler's laugh held all the warmth of December wind through a graveyard. "Your papa did plenty wrong, boy. More than you'll ever understand. And now everyone who trusted him is going to pay the price for his mistakes. The riders departed with their precious human cargo, leaving Emmett bleeding in the hayfield, while dust clouds marked their passage toward hills where old mine shafts provided perfect hiding places for activities that decent people preferred not to think about. By the time he managed to stagger upright and make his painful way toward town, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon. News of the kidnapping reached the ruins of Dr. Everett's clinic through Hannah Reed, who had observed the dust cloud and heard the distant sound of gunfire from her position at the schoolhouse, where she had been attempting to salvage educational materials from the previous night's systematic destruction. She found Eliza and Dasan helping the doctors sort through the charred remains of medical supplies, searching for anything that might prove useful in treating the injuries they all expected to sustain before this crisis reached its conclusion. "They've taken Emmett's boys," Hannah announced without preamble, her face white with shock and growing determination. "I saw riders heading toward the old mine complex up in the hills. 5 men, 2 small figures that could only be children." The impact of her words was immediate and devastating. Eliza sank onto a piece of burned timber, her face draining of color, as she realized that innocent children were now paying the price for her resistance to Lucian's illegal demands. Dasan's hands clenched into fists that seemed carved from granite, while Dr. Everett's left hand began shaking more violently than anyone had seen since the crisis began. "This is my fault." Eliza whispered, guilt crushing down on her like the weight of the entire world. "If I had just signed those papers when they first demanded it." "If you had signed the papers, they would have killed you anyway, to eliminate the only witness to their coercion," Dasan said with firm conviction, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who understood how predators operated. "And then, they would have found another excuse to hurt innocent people. Because that's what evil does. It grows stronger when it's fed, not weaker." Dr. Everett was already methodically gathering what remained of his medical supplies into a salvaged bag, his military training taking over, as he anticipated casualties from whatever rescue attempt they might be forced to mount. "We need to locate where they're holding the boys as quickly as possible. Those old mine shafts form a maze of tunnels and hidden chambers. They could be anywhere in that underground labyrinth." The offer of help came from the source they least expected, but perhaps most needed. Quiet Will stepped forward from where he had been standing silently, his weathered face carrying an expression of determination that hadn't been there before. "I know exactly where they're holding the children," he said, his voice steady, despite the shame that still haunted his eyes. "I can guide you through every tunnel and chamber in that mine complex, show you routes that even Rattler doesn't know exist. But you need to understand something crucial before we proceed. This is absolutely a trap designed specifically to kill all of you." His confession about the scope of his betrayal had created a strange form of liberation, allowing him to speak with the clarity of a man who had nothing left to lose except whatever remained of his honor. "I've been inside that mine complex recently, mapping it for..." He paused, struggling with the admission. "For Lucian's men who wanted to know about alternate escape routes in case their operations were ever discovered by territorial authorities. But that knowledge can serve justice instead of corruption, if you'll trust me to guide you." The plan that emerged was born of desperation and shaped by the grim understanding that delay would only make the situation worse. Quiet Will would lead them through the maze of abandoned tunnels to reach the chamber where the children were being held. Dasan and Eliza would create a distraction at the main entrance, while Dr. Everett and Hannah approached from a secondary route that Quiet Will's reconnaissance had revealed. But as they prepared to embark on what might be their final mission together, smoke began rising from new locations throughout Willow Springs. The systematic destruction that had begun the previous night was continuing in daylight, and they could see orange flames consuming not just individual buildings, but entire blocks of the community they were fighting to save. "They're not just eliminating evidence," Dr. Everett observed, with the tactical awareness that battlefield experience had burned into his consciousness. They're forcing the entire population to choose between fighting fires and organizing resistance. Divide attention, create chaos, eliminate opposition through exhaustion rather than direct confrontation. The fires served another purpose as well. They would provide cover and distraction for whatever final solution Rattler had developed for the troublesome witnesses who refused to be silenced through intimidation or bribery. As evening approached with the inevitability of a funeral procession, their small group made their way toward the hills where justice and corruption would meet in final confrontation among the bones of played-out minds and broken dreams. The abandoned mine complex sat like a malignant wound across the hillside, its entrance yawning black against the star-scattered sky that seemed to mock their desperate mission. Wooden support beams jutted from the scarred earth like broken ribs from some massive industrial corpse, while rusted equipment lay scattered around the site like offerings to the gods of greed and violence. The silence was profound and menacing, broken only by the distant sound of water dripping somewhere deep in the tunnels and the occasional creak of stressed timber that suggested the entire structure might collapse at any moment. It was the kind of place where decent people never went by choice, where the earth itself seemed to have been poisoned by too much human suffering. Eliza crouched behind a boulder with Dasan, both of them studying the defensive layout, while Quiet Will sketched a rough map in the dirt with his finger. His intimate knowledge of the terrain represented their only tactical advantage against men who had chosen the battlefield and prepared it to their specifications. Dr. Everett and Hannah waited 20 yards away, the doctor's salvaged medical bag slung over his shoulder and his service revolver checked and ready, despite the trembling in his hands that had grown more pronounced as the moment of confrontation approached. The weapon felt heavier than memory suggested, weighted not just with metal, but with the knowledge that he might soon be called upon to take lives in order to save them. 3 guards posted at the main entrance. Quiet Will whispered, pointing to shadows that moved occasionally across the tunnel mouth like restless spirits. 2 more stationed inside the first chamber, and Rattler himself with the children in the deepest excavated room. There's a side tunnel here. He indicated a spot on his dirt map that comes up behind where they're holding Timothy and Samuel. How do we know you're not leading us into another carefully prepared trap? Hannah asked quietly, her schoolteacher's instincts having learned to question everything in a world where betrayal had become as common as morning coffee. Quiet Will met her suspicious gaze with steady eyes that held something she hadn't seen there before. A kind of desperate honesty that suggested a man who had looked into the mirror of his own soul and found something worth saving if he could summon the courage to act on it. Because I heard that farmer confess to watching Arthur McBride die for Lucian's profits. He said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. Because I saw what my information did to those innocent children today. Because some things in this world are worth more than silver, and I forgot that truth for far too long. Dasan studied his fellow Apache for a long moment, reading the signs of genuine remorse and determination. With the skill that had kept him alive in 2 different worlds that wanted him to choose sides he wasn't willing to choose. Finally, he nodded with cautious acceptance. "We proceed according to plan," he said simply. "But if you betray us again, I'll kill you myself before Rattler gets the chance." "I understand," Quiet Will replied, and everyone present could hear the sincerity that turned his words into something approaching a sacred oath. "I can't live with any more innocent blood on my hands." The assault began at precisely midnight, when guards would be most tired and least alert to subtle sounds or unexpected movements. Eliza and Dasan approached the main entrance without any attempt at concealment, their primary mission being to draw attention and gunfire while the others worked their way through treacherous passages that might collapse at any moment. "And that's far enough," one of the guards called out as they came within rifle range, his voice echoing off rocky walls worn smooth by decades of wind and rain. "Mr. Armand said you'd probably be coming eventually." You can just turn around and walk away, or you can die here in the dirt like animals. Makes no difference to us which you choose." His words were cut off abruptly by the sharp crack of Dasan's rifle. The shot deliberately aimed not to kill, but to disarm. The bullet struck the man's weapon, sending it spinning from his hands in a shower of wooden splinters while he dove frantically for cover behind whatever protection the rocky ground could provide. Gunfire erupted from the mine entrance, like hellfire given physical form. Muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness, while bullets whined overhead with the sound of angry wasps seeking human targets. Eliza pressed herself against a boulder as lead slugs chipped stone inches from her head, her heart hammering with a mixture of terror and fierce determination. "Can you see the side entrance?" Dasan asked, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency, despite the shoulder wound that sent fresh streams of blood down his arm with each movement. Eliza peered carefully around her rocky shelter and spotted the narrow opening Quiet Will had described, partially concealed by a deliberate fall of loose stone that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. "They're about 50 yards to the left. I can see shadows moving inside." Those shadows would be Dr. Everett Hanna and Quiet Will, beginning their dangerous approach through tunnels that hadn't been properly maintained since the mine played out. Everything now depended on precise timing and whatever luck they could manufacture in this godforsaken place where decent people came to die. Inside the mine, the tunnels formed a nightmare landscape of absolute darkness and disorienting confusion. Dr. Everett led the way with a small lantern that cast flickering shadows on rough-hewn walls, its weak light barely penetrating blackness that seemed to swallow hope along with illumination. Behind him, Hannah clutched her precious ledger and a small pistol with equal determination, while Quiet Will brought up the rear, his intimate knowledge of the tunnel system guiding them through passages that would have been impossible to navigate alone. The sound of gunfire from outside echoed through the underground chambers in a distorted, amplified manner that seemed to come from all directions at once. "This way," Quiet Will whispered, indicating a branch that sloped steeply downward into the bowels of the earth. "The chamber where they're holding the children is just ahead, but we need to move with absolute silence from this point forward." The approaching gunfire had triggered vivid memories of battlefield surgery for Dr. Everett, the screams of wounded soldiers, the desperate attempts to save lives, while artillery tried to eliminate the hospital, along with everything else in range. His hands shook more violently as the sounds brought back images he had spent 15 years trying to forget, but he forced himself to focus on the immediate need to save 2 innocent children whose only crime was having a father who had finally found his conscience. They emerged into a natural cavern that had been enlarged by mining operations, its vaulted ceiling supported by thick wooden beams that groaned ominously under the weight of earth and stone above them. The air was thick with the smell of decay and abandonment, heavy with moisture that seemed to carry the ghosts of men who had died in darkness, pursuing dreams of wealth that had turned to nightmares. At the far end of the chamber, tied securely to one of the massive support beams, Timothy and Samuel Doyle sat with tears streaking their dirt-stained faces. Their terror was so profound, it seemed to create its own atmosphere around them, and the sight of their small forms, bound like sacrificial offerings, made Dr. Everett's stomach clench with rage he hadn't felt since the war ended. Rattler stood nearby with his rifle trained on the tunnel entrance they had just emerged from, as if he had been expecting their arrival with the confidence of a man who had planned every detail of this confrontation. His scarred face bore an expression of cold satisfaction that made everyone's blood run cold. "Right on schedule," he said with obvious pleasure, his voice carrying the tone of a man discussing a successful business transaction, rather than preparing to commit multiple murders. "Mr. Armand predicted you'd come for the children, like the predictable fools you've proven yourselves to be. Makes everything so much simpler when people behave exactly as expected. Let the children go immediately." Dr. Everett said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands that seemed to be getting worse with each passing moment. "Your quarrel is with adults who can defend themselves, Not with innocent children who don't understand what any of this is about. Rattler's laugh echoed harshly off the stone walls, a sound completely devoid of human warmth or mercy. The acoustics of the chamber seemed to amplify the cruelty in his voice, turning it into something that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. My quarrel, Doctor, is with anyone and everyone who gets between Mr. Armand and what rightfully belongs to him. He replied with the casual menace of a man who had made a career of breaking things until they served his purpose. These boys are just useful leverage to ensure Miss Whitlow signs the correct papers. Nothing personal, strictly business. Speaking of Miss Whitlow and business matters, came a new voice from the shadows that sent ice through everyone's veins. Lucien Armand stepped into the lantern light, still impeccably dressed despite the rough surroundings, as if he were attending a board meeting rather than orchestrating multiple kidnapping and murder. Behind him came Sheriff Tom, still wearing that characteristic grin even in circumstances that would have horrified any decent human being. But there was something else in the chamber that caught Dr. Everett's experienced eye: wooden crates stacked against the far wall, and the metallic glint of something that suggested this underground chamber served purposes beyond simple document storage or hostage holding. Miss Whitlow should be joining our little gathering very shortly. Lucien continued in the conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than any amount of shouting would have been. Once she signs the transfer papers, this entire unpleasant business can be concluded to everyone's satisfaction. Well, almost everyone's satisfaction. His smile was cold as a winter grave, carrying implications that made Hannah's blood freeze in her veins. And what exactly is in those crates, Lucien? Dr. Everett asked, his military experience allowing him to recognize something beyond simple paperwork storage. The way the boxes were positioned, the careful spacing between them, and the protective covering it all suggested contents far more valuable and dangerous than legal documents. Lucien's expression shifted into something approaching genuine enthusiasm, like a man finally able to discuss his favorite subject with people who might appreciate the elegance of his planning. Silver ingots, Doctor. The real treasure that makes my dam project worthwhile, he said with the pride of a man displaying his greatest achievement. There's a vein running through that marsh that assays at nearly pure silver ore. The dam isn't just for water management, it's to hide hydraulic mining operations that will strip every ounce of precious metal from that ground before anyone realizes what's happening. The casual admission revealed the true scope of his criminal enterprise. The marsh wouldn't just be flooded, it would be completely destroyed, along with any evidence of the fortune he was stealing from territorial lands that belonged to all the people, not just to men wealthy enough to bribe officials and murder witnesses. Those ingots represent the first extraction from test mining. He continued, clearly enjoying the opportunity to explain his brilliance to an audience that would soon be in no position to repeat what they had learned. Worth more than most people see in a lifetime, and it's just the beginning. Once the dam is complete and the hydraulic equipment is in place, we'll be extracting silver at a rate that will make the California gold rush look like children playing in a sandbox. You won't get away with this. Hannah said, though, even as the words left her mouth, she wondered if they contained any truth at all. The evidence of his crimes was overwhelming, but evidence was useless if no one survived to present it. On the contrary, Miss Reed, I've been getting away with it quite successfully for over a year now. Lucien replied with supreme confidence. Sheriff Wakefield has been most helpful in ensuring that inconvenient questions don't get asked by the wrong people. And inconvenient people don't live long enough to ask questions at all. Haven't you, Tom? Tom's grin widened perceptibly, stretching his face into something that might have been humor if it hadn't been carved from pure malice. All part of maintaining law and order in a civilized community, Mr. Armand. Sometimes keeping the peace means making sure certain secrets stay buried exactly where they belong, 6 feet underground, with the people who used to know them. It was then that the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the connecting tunnels, accompanied by voices that carried clearly in the confined space, despite the ongoing gunfire from the surface that provided a constant background percussion to their deadly confrontation. "The distraction isn't working as well as we hoped," came Dasan's voice, tight with pain and growing concern. "We need to get inside before they realize exactly how few of us there actually are." "This way." Eliza responded, her voice carrying the determination that had sustained her through everything that had brought them to this moment. Quiet Will said the main chamber was accessible through this passage. Rattler raised his rifle toward the tunnel entrance, a cruel smile spreading across his scarred features like poison seeping through clean water. His pale eyes held the anticipatory gleam of a man who had discovered the perfect opportunity to inflict maximum pain on multiple targets simultaneously. "Like fish in a barrel," he murmured with obvious anticipation. But Quiet Will had been waiting for exactly this moment, gathering his courage for the redemption he desperately needed to achieve if he was going to live with himself for whatever time remained to him. With a shout of "Get down!" he threw himself at Rattler with complete disregard for his own safety, grappling desperately for control of the rifle that could end the lives of everyone he had helped put in danger. The two men crashed into a stack of mining equipment with the sound of thunder sending tools and debris cascading across the cavern floor in a metallic avalanche that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The lantern went out immediately in the struggle, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness, broken only by the strobing muzzle flashes as guns began firing in all directions. In the sudden chaos, Dr. Everett dropped to his knees and crawled toward where he remembered seeing the children, guided only by their frightened sobs that cut through the confusion like beacons of innocence in a world gone mad. His medical training took over, allowing him to navigate by touch and sound, while his mind calculated distances and obstacles with the precision that had kept him alive on battlefields where hesitation meant death. "Timothy Samuel, it's Dr. Everett. Stay as low as possible and don't move unless I tell you to." His trembling fingers found the thick ropes that bound the boys to the support beam, and he began working frantically to untie knots that had been secured by experts. The bonds were tight and complex, designed to prevent escape, and his hands were made clumsy by darkness and the adrenaline flooding his system. Behind him, he could hear Hannah's pistol barking as she fired toward the general direction of Sheriff Tom's voice, the small weapon sounding pathetically inadequate against the chaos erupting throughout the chamber. In the tunnel entrance, Eliza and Dasan arrived to find a scene from the deepest circles of hell. The absolute darkness was broken only by muzzle flashes that revealed brief glimpses of struggling figures, but in the confusion, it was impossible to distinguish friend from foe with any degree of certainty. Dasan fired once toward the vaulted ceiling, sending a shower of rock chips raining down and causing everyone to freeze momentarily in the sudden silence that followed the gunshot's echo. "Nobody move," he shouted with commanding authority that seemed to cut through the chaos like a sword through silk. "The next shot goes into whoever's still standing when I count to 3. In the brief stillness that followed his ultimatum, since they could hear Dr. Everett's voice rising above the confusion, "I've got both boys. They're safe for the moment." But the temporary ceasefire shattered like glass when Lucian's voice cut through the darkness with cold, calculated authority that spoke of a man who had moved beyond any pretense of civilization or mercy. "Kill them all immediately," he commanded with the tone of a man ordering livestock slaughtered for market. "We'll sort out the bodies later and blame everything on Apache raiders. No witnesses, no problems, no inconvenient questions from territorial authorities." The gunfight that followed was brutal beyond description, conducted at close quarters in absolute darkness that made accurate aim impossible and friendly fire a constant threat. Quiet Will and Rattler continued their savage struggle for control of the rifle, rolling across the cavern floor and crashing into walls and equipment with bone-jarring impacts that echoed through the chamber like the sounds of titans battling in the depths of the earth. Hannah tried desperately to find adequate cover behind a wooden crate while returning fire toward Sheriff Tom's last known position. her small pistol providing pathetically little protection against the larger weapons being used against them. Dr. Everett continued working frantically to free the children while using his own body as a shield against the bullets that ricocheted off stone walls with deadly unpredictability. Eliza found herself pressed against the tunnel wall as bullets whined past her head, close enough that she could feel the heat of their passing. She could hear Dassan moving somewhere to her right, his breathing harsh with pain from his reopened shoulder wound that was bleeding freely again. The air in the cavern grew thick with gun smoke and rock dust, making every breath a struggle that burned their lungs and throats. Then came the sound that changed everything. A deep, ominous crack from somewhere in the ceiling above them, followed by the groan of overstressed timber. The sustained gunfire had weakened one of the main support beams, and the enormous weight of earth and stone above was beginning to overcome the aging wood that had been holding it back. The ceiling's going to collapse. Quiet Will shouted momentarily, breaking off his life-or-death struggle with Rattler. Everyone out immediately, or we're all going to be buried alive down here. But in the darkness and confusion that had transformed the chamber into a vision of hell on earth, getting out was far easier said than accomplished. Dr. Everett had finally succeeded in freeing the children from their bonds, but Timothy was too terrified to move, and Samuel had been injured when a piece of falling rock struck his left arm, possibly breaking it. "I can't carry both boys and my medical bags at the same time," the doctor called out desperately, his voice strained with the effort of trying to protect two frightened children, while debris rained down around them like hail from an angry sky. "Someone needs to help me get them to safety before this whole place comes down on our heads." Eliza moved toward his voice through the chaos, feeling her way along the wall, with hands that shook from fear and determination in equal measure. Her fingers found Timothy's small, trembling form, and she lifted him despite the sharp pain in her bandaged arm, where Rattler's knife had opened a wound that was bleeding again under the strain. "I've got Timothy," she called out, hoping her voice would carry above the noise of battle and impending collapse. "Hannah, can you help with Samuel?" "I'm trying." Hannah's voice came from near the tunnel entrance, strained with effort and barely controlled panic. "But I can't see anything in this darkness." Above them, more support beams began to groan and crack, with increasing frequency, the sounds mixing with the ongoing gunfire to create a symphony of destruction that seemed to come from the very depths of hell. Dust and small rocks fell constantly now, and everyone could feel the subtle but unmistakable vibration that meant major structural failure was not just imminent, but inevitable. It was Dassan who found the solution that might save them all, though it required a sacrifice that spoke to the depths of his courage and love. Pulling a small mirror from his scouting equipment, a tool used for signaling across great distances, he angled it to catch the faint light filtering down from the tunnel entrance and reflected around the cavern in a moving beam. The reflected light wasn't much, barely more than a candle's glow, but in the absolute darkness, it was enough to reveal positions and major obstacles. More importantly, it allowed them to coordinate their movements instead of stumbling blindly through chaos. "Either," he called out, swinging the makeshift beacon toward where Dr. Everett crouched protectively over Samuel. "Hannah, 10 feet to your left. You can reach them." The schoolteacher moved quickly toward the indicated position, her hands finding the injured boy and helping the doctor lift him toward the tunnel entrance where Eliza waited with Timothy. But as they moved toward what they hoped was safety, the reflected light also revealed their enemies' positions with crystal clarity. Lucian and Sheriff Tom had found cover behind the overturned mining cart, both men taking careful aim at the group trying to rescue the children. The mine owner's face was twisted with rage and something approaching madness as he realized that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him like the mine itself. "You're not leaving here alive," he snarled, his civilized facade finally cracking completely to reveal the murderous insanity that had always lurked beneath the surface. His finger tightened on the trigger of his pistol as he prepared to kill everyone who had witnessed his crimes. The shot that followed was deafeningly loud in the confined space, But it wasn't Lucian who fired. Quiet Will, having finally overcome Rattler in their savage struggle, had managed to get his hands on the dropped rifle. His shot took Lucian in the shoulder, spinning the mine owner around and sending his own shot wild into the stone wall where it shattered rock and sent fragments flying in all directions. Sheriff Tom tried to return fire, but his position behind the mining cart put him directly under one of the most severely damaged support beams. With a crack like thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain, the massive timber gave way, completely bringing down an avalanche of earth and stone that buried the corrupt lawman before he could even scream. Lucian, wounded and seeing his life's work collapsing around him, both literally and figuratively, made one final desperate attempt to salvage something from the disaster. Pulling a small derringer from his vest with his uninjured arm, he aimed it with trembling hands at Eliza as she carried Timothy toward what she hoped was safety. "If I can't have the silver, then nobody can," he screamed, his voice breaking with the strain of madness finally given full expression. "You've destroyed everything I worked for, everything I built. You're going to pay for that with your life." But Dasan was already moving with the fluid grace that had kept him alive in two hostile worlds, throwing himself between Eliza and the gun without any regard for his own safety. The derringer's shot took him in the chest, driving him to his knees as blood bloomed across his shirt like a crimson flower opening in the darkness. Yet even as he fell mortally wounded but not yet defeated, his own rifle came up with the practiced precision of a man who had learned to shoot as naturally as breathing. His final shot struck Lucian's center mass, ending the mine owner's threat forever and ensuring that his silver would remain buried in the earth where it belonged. The cavern was collapsing in earnest now, with major sections of the ceiling caving in systematically as the supporting structure that had held for decades finally surrendered to forces too great for human engineering to resist. Quiet Will helped Dr. Everett carry the injured Samuel, while Hannah guided Eliza and Timothy toward the tunnel entrance that represented their only hope of survival. Behind them, Dasan struggled to his feet, with one hand pressed to his chest, wound his face pale as moonlight, but his determination unshaken by the knowledge that he was probably dying. "Go!" he called out as more beams gave way, with sounds like breaking bones. "I'm right behind you." They stumbled through the tunnel in desperate single file, the walls shaking around them as the entire mine complex began its final catastrophic death throes. Dust filled the air so thickly that breathing became almost impossible, and the sound of falling earth was like continuous thunder that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. They emerged into the cool night air just as the main shaft caved in, completely sealing the underground chambers forever, with a rumble that could be felt for miles in every direction. Dr. Everett immediately began examining the children for serious injuries, while Hannah collapsed against a boulder, coughing up the dust that had filled her lungs and trying to process everything that had happened in the space of a few terrifying minutes. But it was Dasan who commanded everyone's immediate attention and concern. The chest wound was serious, not immediately fatal, but close enough to vital organs that any unnecessary movement might prove dangerous or even lethal. He sat propped against a rocky outcropping, his breathing shallow and labored, while his skin grew progressively paler from blood loss that couldn't be stopped without proper medical intervention. Eliza knelt beside him carefully, her hands hovering over the wound, as if she could somehow hold his life inside through will alone, and the power of love that had sustained them through everything. "Don't you dare leave me now," she whispered with fierce intensity that seemed to make the very air around them tremble. "Not after everything we've been through together. Not when we're so close to having a future. Oh, can I hold you?" he asked weakly, his voice barely audible, but still carrying the familiar words that had become their private prayer, their declaration of love in a world that would have killed them for it. She moved carefully into his arms, feeling the alarming weakness in his embrace, but treasuring every moment of warmth that still flowed between them like a river that refused to be dammed. Around them, the rescued children clung to Dr. Everett, while Hannah methodically documented everything in her ledger, ensuring that the truth of this night would be preserved for history and justice. The battle was finally over, but the cost had been higher than any of them had wanted to pay. Victory, when it came at such a terrible price, felt more like survival than triumph. Dawn broke over the ruins of the mine complex, with a clarity that seemed to wash the world clean of the previous night's violence and terror. The storm that had threatened all evening finally arrived with the sunrise, bringing blessed rain that settled the dust and eased the burning in their throats and lungs from the smoke and debris they had inhaled during their underground ordeal. Dr. Everett worked by the steady light of Hannah's carefully tended lantern, his hands displaying their old surgical precision, despite everything they had endured, as he carefully examined Dasan's chest wound with the gentle thoroughness that had saved countless lives during the war. The bullet missed the heart by less than 2 inches. He announced with quiet relief that was shared by everyone present. It's lodged against a rib, which actually helped control the bleeding significantly. I can remove it safely, but we need to get him somewhere clean and well lit for proper surgery. Timothy and Samuel Doyle clung to each other nearby, their terrible ordeal leaving them shaken, but physically unharmed, except for Samuel's bruised arm where falling rock had struck him. The boys had shown remarkable courage during the entire rescue operation, staying quiet and following instructions even when gunfire erupted around them and the mine began its final collapse. Emmett arrived just as the rain began falling in earnest, having ridden through the night once word reached him that his sons had been freed from their captors. His reunion with Timothy and Samuel was tearful and joyous, marked by the kind of desperate gratitude that comes from nearly losing everything that makes life worth living. "I'm sorry for everything," he said to the group as he held his boys close, his voice breaking with emotion that had been building for 9 months. "For helping Lucian, for keeping quiet about Arthur's murder, for putting all of you in mortal danger, because I was too much of a coward to do what was right from the very beginning. You found your courage when it mattered most." Dr. Everett replied gently, checking Samuel's injured arm with practiced hands that could diagnose problems through touch alone. That's what counts in the final judgment. Quiet Will sat somewhat apart from the others, his own wounds bandaged, but his spirit clearly still wrestling with the weight of his earlier betrayals and the violence he had both caused and helped to end. The redemption he had found in the mine tunnels was real and hard-won, but it couldn't completely erase the guilt that would stay with him for years to come. What happens now? Hannah asked, consulting her comprehensive ledger to ensure she had documented every detail of the night's events for the territorial authorities who would soon arrive to investigate. With Lucian dead, and Sheriff Tom buried under half the mountain who's going to answer for Arthur's murder and all the other crimes that have been committed, and Carter Sior, and Greasy Pete is still alive and working at the mine. Emmett said, his voice carrying the flat conviction of a man who had finally decided to tell the complete truth regardless of personal cost. He was the one who gave me the direct orders to open the sluice gates that killed Arthur, and there are others, foremen and supervisors, who knew exactly what was happening and helped cover it up for their own profit. Dr. Everett nodded thoughtfully as he finished his preliminary examination of Dasan's condition. The territorial authorities will have to launch a full investigation now. Too many witnesses, too much documented evidence, too much public attention for them to ignore or sweep under the rug. Hannah's ledger alone contains enough proof to expose the entire conspiracy. The rain continued to fall steadily as they made their slow way back to Willow Springs, a bedraggled procession of injured and exhausted survivors who had somehow managed to defeat forces that had seemed insurmountable just hours earlier. Dasan rode double with Quiet Will, who had insisted on taking personal responsibility for getting the wounded scout to proper medical care as part of his ongoing attempt at redemption. Eliza walked alongside their horse, her hand resting on Dasan's leg, drawing comfort from the warmth that proved he was still alive and fighting. The touch of his skin through the fabric of his pants was like a lifeline connecting her to hope and the possibility of a future she had almost lost. The town they returned to had been fundamentally changed by the night's events. Word of the confrontation at the mine had spread rapidly throughout the community, and people lined the main street to watch their return, with expressions that ranged from relief and gratitude to anger and uncertainty about what the future might hold. Some faces showed the satisfaction of seeing justice finally served, while others displayed the worried expressions of people who had profited from Lucian's corruption and now faced the prospect of having to make honest livings for the first time in years. Dr. Everett's clinic was gone, reduced to charred foundation stones by the deliberately set fire. But the townspeople had already begun preparing the old church basement as a temporary medical facility. It was there, in the same building where they had found the deed that started their desperate fight, that the doctor performed the delicate surgery to remove the bullet from Dasan's chest. Working by lamplight, while Hannah assisted with steady hands and Eliza held the patient's hand throughout the procedure, Dr. Everett demonstrated the surgical skills that had saved so many lives during the war. His hands, which shook so badly in normal circumstances, became rock steady when lives depended on their precision. The operation was successful, though Dasan would need weeks of careful recovery before he could travel safely or resume any strenuous activities. During that time, the full scope of Lucian's crimes began to emerge as investigators arrived from the territorial capital with broad authority to examine every aspect of the mining operation and its connections to territorial government. Hannah's meticulous ledger proved invaluable in documenting the systematic pattern of bribery, fraud, and intimidation that had corrupted local government for years. Combined with Arthur's secretly maintained records and Emmett's detailed confession, the evidence was overwhelming and impossible to dismiss or explain away. Greasy Pete was arrested within a week, along with 3 supervisors and a mining company clerk who had helped falsify production reports and shipping documents. The evidence against them was ironclad, built from multiple sources and corroborated by physical proof that Quiet Will helped investigators recover from hidden caches around the mine site. A new sheriff was appointed by the territorial governor, James Crawford, who had previously served as a federal marshal, and came with impeccable recommendations from law enforcement officials throughout the region. His first official act was to issue formal apologies to all those who had been threatened, intimidated, or harmed by the previous corrupt administration. And his second was to establish new procedures to prevent such corruption from taking root again. The Copper Gulch mine itself was closed indefinitely, pending a complete investigation of its operation safety procedures and compliance with territorial mining laws. Many of the workers faced temporary unemployment, but the territorial government promised assistance in finding new positions or relocating to areas where honest work was available at fair wages. For Eliza, the legal recognition of her ownership of the marshland came through quickly once the fraudulent opposition was removed by arrests and prosecutions. More importantly, the clause her mother had included about seasonal usage by those who camp peacefully on the eastern bank was formally recognized as a legally binding agreement that protected water access for Dasan's Apache family group. It was a small victory in the larger context of the systematic injustices faced by Native peoples throughout the territory, but it represented something precious and rare. A piece of paper that guaranteed safe passage and access to clean water for several dozen people who had been pushed to the very margins of their ancestral homeland. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the mine, when Dasan's wound had healed sufficiently for him to move without risk, but not yet enough for hard travel, Eliza found herself facing the conversation she had been dreading since the moment she realized she loved him. They met at sunset by the old cottonwood tree, where their relationship had first taken root in soil watered by secrecy and hope. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter, while the marsh grasses rustled with the movement of small creatures going about the eternal business of survival that had continued unchanged despite all the human drama that had played out around them. Dasan's chest wound had healed remarkably well under Dr. Everett's careful attention, leaving only a thin scar as a permanent reminder of how close he had come to death in the service of justice and love. His strength had returned sufficiently for travel, which made this meeting both precious and heartbreaking. They both understood it would be their last together for a very long time, possibly forever. The Army patrol routes are changing for winter operations. Dasan said, his voice steady, but his dark eyes reflecting the pain of what had to be said. Each word seemed to cost him something essential, as if speaking them aloud made the inevitable separation more real. They're increasing security along all the traditional Apache travel paths in response to recent troubles. If I stay here much longer, I'll either have to surrender to the reservation system or risk leading soldiers back to my family group. Eliza nodded, having expected this moment, even as she had dreaded its arrival with every fiber of her being. The practical realities of their situation had never disappeared, only been temporarily overshadowed by more immediate dangers. Now that those dangers had passed, the fundamental incompatibility of their worlds reasserted itself with cruel clarity. Your people need you far more than I do. She said the words tearing at her heart even as she spoke them. They need someone who can guide them to safety, someone who knows both worlds well enough to help them survive what's coming next. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they wanted to say, but couldn't find words for. Finally, Dasan spoke the phrase that had become their private language of love and loss. "Can I hold you?" The familiar words carried new and final weight, as they both understood this was truly goodbye. Not just until tomorrow or next week, but potentially forever. She moved into his arms without hesitation, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek and memorizing every detail of his warmth and strength. For a moment, neither of them could speak. They simply held each other as the sun sank toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to mirror the bittersweet beauty of their parting. Around them, the marsh settled into evening quietude, with only the gentle sound of water moving through the reeds to mark the passage of time that was carrying them toward separation. "There's something I need to show you," Eliza said finally, pulling back from his embrace just far enough to reach into the leather pouch she always carried. "Something I found in my mother's papers that I didn't understand until now, but that changes everything about what we thought was possible." She unfolded a document that was older and more yellowed than the property deed, a handwritten agreement signed by Martha Whitlow and witnessed by Pastor Williams and 2 other church officials whose signatures were still clearly legible. The writing was careful and formal, using the precise legal language required for territorial agreements to have binding force. "It's a permanent water usage covenant," she explained, holding the paper so they could both read it in the fading light. "My mother arranged for perpetual seasonal access to the marsh water for the people who camp peacefully on the eastern bank during winter months. It's not just about your family passing through. It establishes a legal right that can't be taken away by future ownership changes or political developments." Dasan studied the document with growing amazement, and something that might have been hope if he had dared to allow himself such dangerous luxuries. "This means my people can return here every winter legally and safely under territorial law that even the Army has to respect. It means we have a place that truly belongs to us, protected by written agreement, rather than just tradition and memory." "It means more than that," Eliza said softly, her voice carrying the weight of profound realization that was still settling in her mind. It means she understood that love doesn't recognize the artificial boundaries that people try to build between races and cultures. She was preparing for a future where her daughter might love someone from those seasonal camps, where such love might not be just possible, but legal and protected. The revelation was both a precious gift and a bitter reminder of opportunities that might never come to fruition. It provided crucial legal protection for Dasan's people, but it also highlighted the painful irony that Martha Whitlow had shown more vision and acceptance than the world her daughter now inhabited. "She knew," Dasan said with wonder, his voice carrying a note of something approaching reverence. Somehow, across all those years, she knew this day would come and prepared for it. They made practical arrangements as the darkness deepened around them, and the first stars appeared in the clear sky like distant promises of hope. Hannah would file the water covenant with the territorial authorities, immediately ensuring it became part of the permanent official record that would survive changes in local government. Dr. Everett would provide medical supplies that Dasan could carry to his family group, along with a formal letter of introduction that might help if they encountered military patrols during their winter travels. Emmett had offered his wagon and team to help transport supplies to the traditional camping area. When the Apache group arrived for their winter sojourn, his way of continuing to make amends for his earlier complicity in Lucian's criminal schemes. The farmer's guilt would never fully heal, but his commitment to helping others had become a clear path toward personal redemption that gave his life new meaning and purpose. "Will you ever come back?" Eliza asked, though she already knew the answer was far too complicated for any simple yes or no. The political situation was changing, but slowly, and there were no guarantees about what the future might hold for any of them. "When it's safe," Dasan promised, and she could hear the absolute sincerity in his voice that made the words into something approaching a sacred vow. "When the patrol routes shift again, or when the political situation changes enough to allow it. But it might be years, and you shouldn't wait for something that might never happen." "I'm not waiting," she said with quiet determination that surprised them both. "I'm living my life as fully as I can. But I'm also remembering what we had, and I'm hoping for what we might have again someday when the world becomes more reasonable about matters of the heart." As their final goodbye stretched into the star-filled night, the sound of approaching horses made them both tense until they recognized Quiet Will's silhouette emerging from the darkness. He led 2 horses and carried supplies for the dangerous journey ahead, his own redemption having taken the form of dedicating himself completely to helping Dasan's family group survive the coming winter. "The eastern pass will remain clear for another week," he reported quietly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won knowledge about army movements and patrol schedules. "After that, we'll need to take the longer route through the canyon country to avoid the increased military presence in the area." Dasan rose reluctantly from beside the cottonwood, knowing that further delay would only make the parting more difficult for both of them. The practical necessities of survival had to take precedence over emotional needs, no matter how much it hurt to acknowledge that reality. He kissed Eliza one final time, a tender farewell that carried all the love they couldn't speak aloud in a world that would never fully accept what they had found in each other's hearts. The kiss tasted of tears and promises and possibilities that might never be fulfilled. But it was also filled with a kind of fierce joy that defied the circumstances trying to tear them apart. "Keep the marsh safe and wild," he said, his voice breaking slightly with the weight of everything he was leaving behind. "Keep it the way it was when we first met here and fell in love, despite every reason the world gave us not to. Always," she promised. And he could hear the absolute conviction in her voice that made the word into something approaching a sacred oath. She watched from beneath the ancient cottonwood as the 2 Apache men rode away into the darkness, their horses' hoofbeats gradually fading until only the familiar night sounds of the marsh remained to keep her company, standing alone in the place where their forbidden love had bloomed despite all the odds against it. Eliza felt the full weight of loss and the surprising strength of hope intertwined in her heart like 2 rivers flowing toward the same distant sea. The final surprise came the next morning when Sheriff Crawford arrived at her door with news from the territorial capital that would change not just her future, but the future of everyone in Willow Springs. The investigation into Lucian's criminal activities had uncovered evidence of mining fraud that went far beyond their small community, involving territorial officials and federal contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. "There's going to be a substantial reward," Crawford explained, his honest face reflecting the satisfaction of seeing justice finally served after years of watching corruption flourish unchecked. The federal government is offering significant compensation to those who provided evidence that helped expose this widespread conspiracy. Your testimony and the documents you preserved are considered absolutely crucial to the entire case. The monetary amount was more substantial than Eliza had ever imagined possible, enough to secure her future permanently and provide resources for improving the town that had suffered so long under Lucian's corrupt influence. But more important than the money was the official recognition that their desperate fight had exposed a cancer that reached far beyond their small community, into the highest levels of territorial government. As autumn deepened into winter and the first snow began to dust the mountains where Dasan had disappeared, Willow Springs began the slow process of healing from years of systematic corruption and intimidation. A new doctor arrived to work alongside Dr. Everett, bringing modern equipment and advanced medical techniques that promised better care for everyone in the community. Hannah was officially appointed as the town clerk, her meticulous record-keeping finally receiving the recognition and authority it had always deserved. Her first official act was to establish new procedures for maintaining public records that would make future corruption much more difficult to hide or sustain. Emmett used part of his reward money to establish a scholarship fund in Arthur McBride's memory, helping young people throughout the territory learn to read and write regardless of their family's financial circumstances. The fund would ensure that Arthur's dedication to learning and self-improvement would live on to benefit future generations who might otherwise never have the opportunity for education. And Eliza kept the marsh wild and free, exactly as she had promised. She walked its familiar paths every evening at sunset, watching for the day when two riders might emerge from the eastern hills with news of safe journeys and successful winters spent in the traditional way. She didn't know when that day would come, but she knew with absolute certainty that it would come eventually. Love she had learned through painful experience was not always about possession or constant proximity. Sometimes it was about trust and hope, and the courage to let go when holding on would cause harm to the people you cherished most. The marsh held her memories and her dreams in its seasonal cycles of death and renewal, and in those eternal rhythms she found the patience to wait for whatever future might unfold. The Water Usage Covenant was officially filed and approved by territorial authorities, creating a small but important precedent for native rights that would influence later legal decisions throughout the region. Dr. Everett's hands grew steadier as the town's medical needs gave him renewed purpose beyond his haunting war memories. Hannah's comprehensive ledgers became the foundation for honest, transparent government in Willow Springs that would serve as a model for other communities struggling with similar problems. As winter settled over the territory and the marsh froze into crystalline beauty that took her breath away, Eliza began teaching the children of Willow Springs about justice and love that transcends artificial boundaries. She told them stories of courage in the face of corruption, of love that defies social conventions, and of the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the cost seems unbearable. The children listened with wide eyes and open hearts, and in their eager faces, Eliza saw the hope for a future where love might be judged by its sincerity, rather than the color of the lover's skin, where justice might prevail over greed, and where the wild places like her beloved marsh might remain free for all people to share in peace. When spring arrived with its promise of renewal and the marsh grasses turned green again, Eliza was teaching a particularly attentive group of children about the importance of keeping written records when she saw them, two riders approaching through the willows, moving with the quiet confidence she remembered so well. Her heart leaped as she recognized Dasan's silhouette, and beside him rode Quiet Will, both men looking weathered, but well, their faces carrying the satisfaction of people who had successfully completed a difficult and dangerous journey. The children scattered with excited whispers as she walked toward the approaching riders, her pulse quickening with each step that brought her closer to the man she had never stopped loving, despite all the months of separation and uncertainty. When Dasan dismounted and stood before her, she could see new lines around his eyes and fresh scars on his hands that spoke of a hard winter and the kind of challenges she could only imagine. but his smile was the same one that had first captured her heart, and his eyes held the same depth of feeling that had sustained her through the darkest moments of their ordeal. "Can I hold you?" He asked the familiar words, carrying all the love and longing of their separation, but also something new, a note of hope that hadn't been there before. "Say hello," she whispered, changing their old goodbye into a greeting as she moved into his arms with the joy of a river finally reaching the sea. "Say we're home." The embrace that followed seemed to contain all the promises they had been afraid to make, all the dreams they had been afraid to dream, and all the love they had carried through the long months of separation. Around them, the marsh whispered its ancient secrets, while the river flowed toward distant horizons, carrying with it the promise that some loves are strong enough to survive any distance, any danger, any difference that the world might place in their path. In Willow Springs, justice had triumphed over corruption, hope had conquered despair, and love had found its way back to where it belonged. The future stretched before them like an unmapped territory full of possibilities. And for the first time since they had met by these waters, they faced it together.